So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Lessons from the Field, Data Resilience and Recovery. Today, it's an interactive discussion between members of the panel, and the whole idea is that we'll talk about the years of field experience, and hopefully this will provoke reflection on your own architecture. The purpose of the presentation today is to talk about data that's residing on your premise. So not SaaS data, so not data in software applications or cloud data. This is data that's on your premise. So let me introduce my first guest. I'll hand the mic over to Dominic.
Hi, my name is Dominic McLaughlin. I'm the director of Autodata. We're a data resilience focused managed service provider based in the UK. I've been with the company for about 21 years now, and I get involved in all aspects of the business. Work quite closely with Ant, so I'll hand over to him now.
Hi guys, I'm Ant Buckner. I'm head of data center and cloud for Autodata. I've been in the industry about 30 years with very much a focus on data resilience, and I look after our data center and cloud portfolio.
Great, thanks guys. And I'm Rob Orton from Technical Marketing at Scality. And we also have Adam Carr on here who's going to help answer questions. So thanks for doing that, Adam. Okay, just to set the scene a little bit, I've got a few slides. So backup used to be about recovery from accidental deletion or hardware failure. So back in those sort of disaster recovery days. But now backup has a very different role. In terms of ransomware attacks, they almost always, so 89% of the time, they target the backup repositories. And the reason for this, it's obvious. So without a backup, you're more likely to pay the ransom. And ransoms these days, they're asking a lot of money. So typically we see them at about $1 million, sometimes more, sometimes less. But I mean, that's a large amount for a business to withstand. And surprisingly, more than half of the people actually pay this sort of ransom. Why is having a backup no longer enough on its own? And what does stronger cyber resilience look like these days, Dominic?
I think it's important that people don't treat it as a tick box exercise. Often we find people just put backup in place, that's it. They don't really think of it beyond a utility. Really, you need to have a robust data resilience strategy in place and treat it as an essential insurance policy against operational downtime rather than just a tick box. What I mean by that is, often we find people put backup in place, but they don't validate that resilience via, regular tests. So they don't do restore tests. They don't have any resilience assessments to review RTO, RPO, immutability, air gapping, ransomware posture, etc. What we typically find is customers would put something in place, but they don't really have an effective recovery strategy. And, as you mentioned, we're talking about on-prem. So when a disruption occurs, they can't really recover in time. A lot of the time it's because they either don't have anything on-prem to recover on-prem critical data, and they're just looking to recover from a cloud repository, or they don't have a truly immutable repository on-prem and it's been compromised. Going back to one of your previous slides, I think it was something along the lines of high 80% of ransomware attacks are starting to focus on the backup environment first. Obviously, if they can compromise your backup, you really find yourself in a situation where you either lose data or pay a ransom. A lot of people will think they have an effective recovery strategy in place, but when a disruption happens, they find that wasn't the case, often because they're trying to recover critical on-prem data from a cloud repository, and it just simply isn't quick enough. I mean, Anne, I imagine you've probably got examples of customers that we've dealt with who've faced that problem on numerous occasions, right?
I mean, what we tend to see is that obviously clients, especially clients of ours, they'll have, resilient, immutable data in the cloud. They'll have an immutable repository which will supplement whatever they have on premise, assuming they've got something on premise. But obviously, when you get attacked, the first thing you do essentially is you unplug from the outside world. So even connecting to that cloud repository can take a week. Your incident response teams, they need to come in, they need to essentially try to evaluate the cause of the attack and then put a strategy in to recover. And then when you do finally connect to the cloud repository, you're then bringing down a single VM at a time or a few VMs at a time, testing them, and then putting them back into production. So typically we see, unfortunately from our experience, clients who rely only on the cloud as their form of recovery. It can take 3-4 weeks to get critical systems back up. It can take 6 weeks to get back to full operation. And I think that is really often misunderstood, because people have something on premise and they say, well, hopefully that will be fine. But as we know, unfortunately now, as was on Rob's slide, on-premise repos as part of that backup attack are going to be part of the first stage of the sort of attack surface. So if you don't have something immutable on-premise that you can recover from, you're immediately having to go to the cloud as your option. So rather than it being kind of the last line of defense, we'll only use it if we have to, in a ransomware scenario, typically it's your only step is having to use the cloud, which obviously, as we've said, comes with the limitations.
And I think the other issue is a lot of clients think that their on-prem repository is immutable. It's immutable at the application level, but it's not actually immutable at the appliance level. So if ransomware gangs are getting into your systems, they're able to get credentials, escalate privileges, and suddenly go into those, in inverted commas, immutable repositories and start to change or alter settings, which means that that repo is compromised. And I think again, and that's quite common. We find immutability is sometimes an overused word, or it's used in the wrong context.
It's become part of the marketing parlance now, isn't it?
Yeah, more than the actual technical side of it.
Right? I mean, when we started looking at immutable repositories, it was de facto. It meant that once you've written data, it can't be deleted, modified, in any way altered for a predetermined period of time by anyone. And the by anyone is a very important part, because immutability, obviously we're talking about ransomware here as a primary issue, but obviously whether it be accidental, whether it be inside threats, immutability originally meant it doesn't matter who you are, you cannot delete or modify that data, as I said, until the timer has run out. Unfortunately, I've seen lots and lots of companies now adding you can use it's now an immutable appliance with just a software update, or we've got a new feature release that it's now immutable. That is very, very rarely the case. In fact, I can't think of one case where that is actually true. Ultimately, there is still really only one form of immutability. We call it truly immutable. There's other terms like absolute immutability. And the reason why we've had to add this extra term on top of immutability is purely because it's being misused.
So the point is that it's immutable at a data level, but not immutable at the storage appliance level, so that if someone compromises and gets access to the storage level, they can affect the immutability. That's the point, right? So it's immutable at one level, but not at a level that can be compromised. So ergo, it is not immutable. I think your point was always, and if speaking to clients going, can you access the appliance? If you can, they can. And that's probably the question people need to be asking, right?
Well, I actually had this call with a client this week where I said, what do you have on premise? Because we were actually talking about their use of a cloud storage platform. I said, and I assume it's immutable because their backup tool they use supports immutability. The storage cloud storage service they have supports immutability. So I just assumed they would be using it. And they said, oh, no, we don't, because we have an immutable appliance. And we spoke about that appliance, and it was quite clear that their appliance was not immutable. So for them, it's quite a quick fix, at least to get our level of immutability on the cloud side. But as far as the on-premise appliance is concerned that they have, it's never going to support full immutability. So if someone did gain access into their system and they did elevate up their privileges, it isn't just a case that they could go into the particular repository, they could flatten the entire repository and the client would have no on-premise data at all. And because they don't have, or didn't have at least, an immutable repository in the cloud, it also means their cloud repository could be compromised as well because it didn't even have immutability on it. So I think it's, as I said at the start, I think marketing terms have kind of taken over here. Really, the line in the sand is if you can do it, sooner or later, a ransomware gang could elevate their privileges and they could do it. And that's really where the line should be.
Yeah, so it's clear, I think, that the term immutability might be fine at the application layer, but customers and people, IT leaders, need to make sure that the entire solution is completely cyber resilient. So, it's rock solid. No one can break into that and compromise the backup.
Yeah.
And since, I guess, the good old days when backup was more about DR than it was for ransomware protection, what do you think has changed between sort of then and now?
I think there's some good news. I think there's bad news. I think the good news is we're all much more aware. 5 or 6 years ago, I think ransomware really was just becoming a thing and becoming the thing that everyone was concerned about. And I think whereas now it's there's board level conversations. Are we protected? Are we resilient? A lot more, budget is being put in to ensure that both you've got front end protection and hopefully back end protection as well. But ultimately, there's also been a lot of change with how ransomware attacks are done. It's it's now a blanket approach. It's not targeted attacks. You've got ransomware as a service. Obviously, AI is now forming part of that sort of attack toolkit. Data sets are getting larger, so we're putting more data often out into the cloud, and but our pipes haven't necessarily grown. So whereas we might have been able to, had it have been 5 terabytes, 10 terabytes, we might have been able to recover that once we can get connection to it. Maybe we could recover that in a reasonable time frame. Now it could be hundreds of terabytes, and even if you've got a 1 gig, 10 gig pipe direct connects to cloud storage, it's still going to take a while to get that back. And I think the other part is that, kind of back to what I was saying before, tape was a thing. If we go back, maybe not 5 years, certainly 5 to 10 years, it was ubiquitous. Now, in the last 5 years, we've seen a lot less tape. And it's not that, that's a bad thing. The cloud is absolutely ideal. It's usable, it's reliable, it's got a much higher degree of durability. And again, none of what we're talking about means that cloud shouldn't be part of the conversation. Cloud absolutely is part of the conversation. But again, back to if your data is time sensitive and critical, that the cloud is not the ideal place to store that. It might be something you store for long term for compliancy. If you need a year's worth of backup points, the cloud's absolutely ideal for that, because it's unlikely you're going to want to go back 7 months to do a restore of a particular VM, but you might need it for compliancy. But I think what's changed is that people have still got those same on-premise devices that they had before, if you like, they implemented the cloud. But they still feel that on-premise device is part of their recovery strategy from ransomware. And that, I think, is really the change, because attacks now are very much backup first. I mean, I think that was on your slide, but backup is not just part of the attack. It's often the first thing that is attacked, because ultimately, if you can recover from a backup, or if you can recover full stop, it's very unlikely you're going to pay a ransom. It doesn't mean it's not going to cost your business a great deal of money, but it's obviously, even paying a ransom is unreliable. I mean, that wasn't on your stat sheet, but I think it's something like, even if you pay a ransom, you only get 60% of people get their data back, or only 60% of data get it back. So I think that's an issue. I think also, if you do pay a ransom, typically you go onto another list of their ransomware payers, so they'll sell that to someone else, and then it's very possible you'll get attacked again in a very short time period. So I think there's lots of changes, but to me the biggest is that because they are now targeting backup first, you now need to think about what that on-premise device is. If that is part of your recovery strategy, if that's critical for your RTOs that you've got agreed with the business, then you need to really think about, is that going to protect you? Is it going to be usable in a ransomware scenario? Because if it isn't, you've got to then plan around, well, we're going to need to at some point reconnect to the cloud, and then how long is it going to actually take to get that data back? And as Dom said, I think very few customers actually fully test how long that would take.
And I think going back to the AI point as well, and obviously AI is being enabled to actually increase the amount of, cyber attacks, but also the data sets are growing so much as people are adopting AI. So people's data sets are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and will continue to get bigger. Obviously, the bigger the data set, the bigger the backup, so the longer it's going to take to recover. So I think the recovery times will only increase as people's kind of data grows. And as I mentioned, it's not like internet access in the UK and connectivity is keeping pace with that. So I think the bottleneck will just get worse, really, as data increases. And that's something that we've seen change a lot over the last 5 years. You were talking about terabytes, and now you're talking about hundreds of terabytes. And it will soon be, give it a few years and a petabyte won't be much, and we'll be talking about whatever comes after.
Indeed, yeah. So thanks for that. I forgot to mention at the beginning that in order to keep this session a little bit more interactive, we're going to have a few polls dotted throughout. So these polls are just meant to sort of tongue-in-cheek, just meant to let you reflect on your thoughts and your infrastructure a little bit. So we'll go for the first one. I'll open this now. Feel free to answer, and we'll probably loop back at the end. But the first poll is public cloud for primary backups, yes or no? So please feel free to go ahead and vote in that. In the meantime, and I've heard you say in the past that backup is easy, but recovery is hard. If a CTO wants to recover a large environment in the quickest possible time, i.e. the lowest RTO, what do you think are the technical must-haves that they need to include, or they're likely missing?
I mean, if I was asked that question or given that as a statement, the first thing I'd try to do is establish what that RTO is. What does the quickest actually mean? Because obviously, depending on how much you want to spend, often has a reflection on that. So obviously it needs to be on premise. I think all the things that we've mentioned means, you could probably have that as an immediate takeaway. Unless you've got either a small amount of data, so a very small amount of data, and a large amount of bandwidth capability, so that you can at least connect to the cloud and get the data quickly. But again, back to my original point, you've still got a delay between when you're even going to be able to open that connection. So essentially, you need a device that is sitting within your firewall, sitting within your network to recover from, because that you're going to be able to access immediately if it is immutable. So second point, it obviously has to be, again, our terminology, truly immutable. It has to be something that you can rely on to recover from. And then it's kind of the normal hardware stuff. So the type of disk, NVMe, SSD, obviously spinning disk or a combination of all of those, network connectivity, making sure that it's built and optimized for your environment. And obviously it's something that you guys can support and manage, because again, there's no point in you having a box that, you install on day one, no one touches it for 4 years, and then you have an attack and find that your box isn't reliable, it is untested and whatever. So again, making sure that that's regularly patched and maintained, and either you've got the skill set to do that yourself, or that you're using a company that's got the skill set to do that for you. So as I said, it sounds a straightforward question, but in my experience, it's a nuanced question that does require a budget conversation as well, because there's some things that are always going to be the case. It needs to be within your network, but there's obviously some things that can be open to interpretation. I think you'd say.
I think as well, it needs to be, available. It needs to be clustered. We talk about the threat being ransomware, but obviously lack of availability of systems is a problem as well. So whatever solution you're putting in place around an on-prem repository, you should be looking to make it highly available, to cluster it, to make sure that you can accept multiple node failures. So that's another important point. Obviously, that's, again, budget willing as such, but to put the right solution in place, don't forget about the actual availability of that piece of hardware as well.
Yeah, there's no point of hardware failure interrupting your best laid plans at the time that you need that speed of recovery as well.
Yeah, it's
guaranteed that'd be the
case. Exactly. It's like, good job we've got this, and then it doesn't, it fails. So it's an important point, because there's a lot of solutions on the market that will handle this kind of scenario, but don't allow you to implement multi-node clusters as well, which is obviously an important part of the resilience strategy.
Okay, thanks for that. So we have another poll. So people have been answering the previous one, so that's great. We'll loop back to that. The next poll is, again, slightly thought-provoking. For backup, is tape dead? So we've started that poll. So please feel free to chip in and vote on that one.
Is tape dead? And is tape not dead everywhere? I mean, I can't remember the last time I saw a tape. Well, I suppose I should really interject and start kind of caveat
leading the poll.
Yeah, I think tape still has a really important place in archive, like cold deep archive, and sort of media archive, and like you just need to look at a cold storage on the hyperscalers, for that sort of response. People do use it, but I think for backup, it's quite nuanced, like you say. So some people do like the idea of, they maybe don't trust the immutability side. They like to physically eject the tape and put it in a safe somewhere else, which, yes, would cause some operational issues later down the line. But it's a really good safety blanket, is knowing that. So
I think it's very rare now, though, isn't it, really, Ant, that we speak to customers and they are still using tape. Well, especially over the last 5 years, I think it's kind of phased out a lot as a backup medium. But it'd be interesting to see what, the audience have to say, because, we obviously have some opinion on it, but you can't speak for everyone, I guess. Sorry, you were going to say.
Yeah, I was going to say that most conversations we have about tape, if someone's got tape, absolutely, it's included in the strategy. Why not? You've bought it, you've paid for it. It can be part of your strategy. It can be another layer of your security onion, if you like. But the reality of it is that we do have these conversations a lot. The tapes died. The tape drives died. We've had a look at buying a new tape drive, and obviously with that, the tapes and the management and the maintenance, and then extended maintenance and warranties and all the rest of the stuff, and then the operational cost of running it. Are there digital solutions now that can give you an alternative to tape? Yes, there are. I mean, you mentioned those kind of deep archive stores. Yeah, absolutely, that's one option. But you've also got options where essentially the data isn't visible. So it acts as that kind of, I've put it in the safe equivalent. There is no programmatic connection to it. So in our experience, from a backup perspective, we are seeing less and less and less. And when we do talk about it, it's often, it's finally gone pop after 8 years, and we want to look at either an alternative or obviously a cloud solution.
Sorry for initiating an answer to your poll question. At this early stage, I apologise for that. I'll keep quiet.
No, that's fine, actually. So I mean, it's quite a strong response. We've got 91% of people that saying no, it's not. So I think people definitely reflect.
Interesting.
Yeah, with something about that. So maybe speed of recovery isn't so much an issue. It's more about that sort of physical well-being of the data.
And like you say, the whole archiving piece. If you go to AWS cold storage, it's going to be on archive. So depending on people's retention policies, I'm kind of backtracking here, but I was probably a little bit too presumptive about saying, do we have tape anywhere? But yeah, I mean, AWS Deep Glacier archive, it's all on tape, right? So it's not dead if you don't really need to access that data anymore. In fact, it's probably the most cost-effective way of archiving off data that you're likely not going to need, but probably need to keep from a regulatory perspective. So yeah, I think it's a nuanced question. And I suppose if I'm going back into it again, but if we're talking about is tape dead as a kind of primary medium for production backup, then yes, most likely. But when it comes to archive, absolutely not. So I've dug myself out that hole a little bit.
No, I think it is important to point out the nuance of the question. So for backup, so maybe it should have said for primary backup is tape dead, but
no, I think if you don't nuance it, you certainly get more of a response, which is probably important as well, and it's more thought provoking if you're a bit how could I put it, not nuanced, a bit more direct. But anyway, I said I was going to shut up, didn't I? So.
All right, so let's move on to the next question. I mean, you kind of mentioned earlier on around the cost. So, I mean, some, I guess, mid-market customers might find that this idea of having an on-prem version of backup is quite high. So how would you explain the ROI of this high-performance recovery to a CFO who thinks that public cloud is cheaper, maybe? Dominic.
I'll take that one. I mean, obviously, you have to take into account the cost of the solution, right? We talk about return on investment or ROI, but I think people really need to start thinking about the cost of inaction, or COI, which I thought was an acronym we came up with, but it's actually a well-used one. So what I mean by cost of inaction is, operational downtime destroys bottom line. So every day that you cannot access your systems, every day your staff cannot access systems and applications, and every day your customers are in the same position, you are losing revenue. Staffing costs alone, I mean, they're often overlooked, but going back to Ant's point, you get hit by disruption, let's just say for argument's sake, ransomware, because it's so prevalent. Cut yourself off from the outside world, bring an incident response team in, start to kind of work out how that piece of malware's got into your network, try and clean it up, find the artifacts, do your due diligence. Then you start to recover, hopefully quickly. Hopefully, if it's critical data on-prem, you're doing it from on-prem. If not, you might have to resort to doing it from a cloud repository. Every single day costs money, and every single one of those days, you'll probably find your staff can't work efficiently because they can't access systems. And put together a calculator around, the cost of inaction. And I think if you're a 1,000 user company with everybody on minimum wage, just one day of your staff not working is about £90,000 worth of lost money and lost productivity. So first things first, how many staff have you got, and how much would it cost you if they weren't working even for one day, which I think is often overlooked. Secondly, the loss of revenue, which is generally easy or easier to work out. If you have critical data on premise running revenue generating systems and those systems are down, how much is that going to cost you? How many customers will not be able to transact with your business? Again, that's probably significantly more than lost productivity from staff not working, especially if you're in a regulated industry or if you're in financial services as an example. And then, really I would say the biggest cost, and the one that isn't really that easy to quantify, is the loss of brand reputation and reputational damage. So for example, I think we spoke about the Marks and Spencer's example, which I'll raise again, which I think is a good anecdote for reputational damage, in that everybody's aware of that M&S breach. It was pretty bad, and their systems were down for a while. But as consumers, we tend to forget what's in the press. It's one thing after another. I went online a few weeks later to buy a pair of shorts for my son for school, and I went to M&S. That's who I would normally use. I went in there and I was like, oh my goodness, I can't buy them because the website's down. So I went to George of Asda, and they were cheaper, and now I won't buy any of my school shorts from M&S. So that's really hard to quantify, but all the while people can't access your systems, your customers are probably going elsewhere. So really, yes, look at the cost of the solution. It might be 50 grand, it might be 100 grand, it might be 200 grand, it might be more, but contextualize that with how much operational downtime is going to cost you in loss of staff productivity, loss of revenue generation for whatever period of time, and then that hard to quantify loss of brand reputation, which you may never be able to get back. So I think that's an important point to make, really, is don't just fixate on this is going to cost me X. Treat it, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, a proper data resilience strategy should be seen as an insurance policy against operational downtime, which affects bottom line. So that would be how we would typically have that conversation with someone in the C-suite or a CFO. It's very much a risk mitigation that you're paying for. Nobody thinks twice about paying for insurance policies. People will pay hundreds of thousands of pounds for cyber insurance, but really what they should be doing is putting that investment into processes and systems that can help to prevent, the horse from bolting as such.
I think when you actually look at the cost, having had those calculators that we can use, realistically, having an on-premise device versus cloud, again, none of this, by the way, means that, as I said, cloud isn't part of the strategy. It absolutely is. But having something on-premise typically will give you at least a week faster recovery, at least a week. And so when we've sort of analysed that and the cost of buying a device versus the cost of downtime, typically you're getting a return within one event over a 5-year period and a significant cost saving on top of that. So essentially, unlike and obviously you're using it as a backup device anyway, so it has a functional benefit on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to, let's just look at an insurance policy. If you don't have an incident for 5 years, well, you've just paid that money. There's no return. You've had no use for it. You've just paid your money. End of story. Whereas when you have a look at one of these devices, they're something that you use on a functional basis every day, just to do a backup on premise. And on top of that, if you have a single event, generally within a day, 2 days, half a day, depending on the amount of data that you have that's critical and time sensitive, because obviously that's all you need to size it for. You're not sizing it for all of your backup. It's just the stuff you need back super fast that's really critical to your business. When we've analysed it, it's, as I said, certainly a week, you're more than making a cost saving, so a singular event, but it's generally half a day to 2 days, you've got a return on your investment from a singular event. You have 2 events, obviously it stacks up quick.
Yeah, or your revenue generation is in the millions of pounds a day. So for some organisations, they might make the money back in a couple of hours, basically. It's important to note as well, the point you made, Anne, is it's sized for your critical on-prem data. We'd still recommend you obviously tier off less critical data into the cloud, so you're not having to store all your data on-prem, because obviously that would push up your costs. But you've got to identify what critical systems you have on-premise, and obviously what that critical data is, and ensure that that's held within a truly immutable on-prem repository. Other stuff you can just back off to the cloud, because if someone can't access emails from however long ago or legacy data, it's not really going to affect your productivity, your revenue generation, or your brand reputation. So I think that's an important point to note as well.
Yeah, what we typically see is that clients will have, if they don't have an truly immutable device currently, they'll put one in. They'll still keep whatever devices that they've already got in place, or if it was direct to cloud only before, they'll still keep that as a strategy. So then it's not like they're wasting any money that they've spent on it, but what they'll do is they'll put these devices in specifically to cover that critical time sensitive data. So often they'll run them side by side. Obviously, we have got examples where clients have gone, we just want to know it's all completely protected, and that's absolutely fine. They can be sized accordingly, but often we'll find it might only be 20% of the data that someone would be backing up to the cloud, because again, you're not looking to necessarily store a year's worth of data, because you're not going to be recovering something that's 9 months old. You want to recover from yesterday or the day before. That's going to be the data recovery point. So if you're keeping 7 days, 14 days, a month's worth on premise, and again, only of your critical data, it's a much smaller subset than you would typically have on a normal device, or even just storing in the cloud.
Yeah, and definitely, like you said, it's super important to have this on-premise fast restore capability, but it's equally important to make sure that you've got an off-site copy of that data, and the cloud is absolutely ideal for that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the final poll. So let me kick this one off. The question is, how long would your business survive without its critical data? So less than 3 days, 4 to 7, 8 to 11, 12 to 14, or over 2 weeks. So it'll be interesting to see what attendees feel about the, I guess, strength of recovery and how quickly they can access that data. Whilst that poll is building up, why don't we go back to the first one and see what the response was. So the question was public cloud for primary backups, yes or no? So we had a no at 80%. So I think this very much agrees with what we were saying, right? So like I just mentioned as well, public cloud definitely has its place for backup data, and this is primarily like a large sort of time window and data window of data that's physically stored off your site, and 20% of people have said yes.
Of that 80%, it'd be interesting to understand how many of them are running on-prem repositories that are truly immutable at the appliance and the storage level, because typically we find customers aren't aware that their repository can be compromised by, I wouldn't say simple privilege escalation, but it's certainly something that is well within the remit of malicious actors to escalate privileges and get inside that piece of hardware and render it ineffective. So I think there's very few solutions on the market at the right price point for the mid-market that can actually mitigate that risk. And as Ant said, immutability is often a marketing word. And yes, your data is immutable, but the appliance isn't immutable. Ergo, the whole solution is non-immutable, if that's even a phrase. So yeah, that'd be interesting to understand.
I mean, what we found is, again, over the last couple of years, because of the types of services we do, unfortunately, we've had a reasonable number of clients who have obviously been hit with ransomware, and we either don't know about it at all. I mean, statistically, there must have been quite a lot, but we either don't know about it at all, or we're part of their recovery strategy, so they might reach out to us, and obviously we'll be talking them through potentially how to get back in as timely a fashion as possible. What I will say is that I think, without exception, every client who hasn't had a truly immutable repository, who has gone through a ransomware event, every one of them, we've been able to get their data back because they have had immutable repositories, and we've been able to see that the attackers were trying to compromise the cloud data but haven't been able to. So at least they've all been able to recover, but every one of them, I'm pretty sure everyone without exception, has gone on to have a fully, truly immutable appliance, because they can't go through that event again. And some of those have been in education, for example, which typically do not have a large budget to spend on, additional hardware, so to speak. Others have been corporate, but again, it doesn't really matter the situation. Once you've been through that kind of multi-week level event, no one wants to go back there again because of the multitude of impacts that has. And actually, to protect against it is relatively inexpensive, when you compare the two things together. So
I think that's the point. The cost of the downtime is so extortionate in comparison to putting a solution in place that people just turn around and go, it's going to cost X. Why wouldn't we do it? Unfortunately, it often takes post-breach for people to come to that conclusion.
I think tying in with that information you were saying, Ant, around the sort of level of downtime, the results from the final question poll, so how long would your business survive without its critical data? Interestingly, about a fifth, 22%, have said over 2 weeks, but the majority of people, 44%, say 4 to 7 days. So, like, in your examples, you were talking about weeks worth of downtime. So, it's interesting to see that people really need to stand up to this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think when most people have a look at their strategies, I just think this is something that's kind of just, again, I can only speak to the clients that we speak to, but there's hundreds of them. So I think we've got a good window. And I just think this is something that's really been ignored. They've got the ability to recover. They might even have like an on-premise device that gives them the ability to recover quickly. But unfortunately, those two things aren't the same. The device that they want to use to recover quickly is often actually likely to be compromised, and their last line of defense, which may be full immutability in the cloud, it might be slow. So when you combine it all and you look at it all on paper, can we get our data back quickly, and is it really secure? The answer is yes. But if the on-premise device gets compromised, you have to use the cloud to recover. And that, I think, is the part that's often missed. And I also think when people do tests, what they're not including is that first pull the plug. We don't want to, have any data egressed out of the environment. We don't want them to keep potentially spreading to systems that haven't been compromised yet. So you are pulling out from the outside world, and the reality of it is I don't think that's often taken into account. And again, certainly in our experience, I don't think the companies we've worked with have necessarily considered that. And actually, we've also got examples where clients had devices that did support quite a good level of immutability, but they'd ended up turning it off because it was affecting performance. So, that hasn't been the case in many, I'm pleased to say. But ultimately, that's another part I know we haven't touched on, but you want a device that is designed to be immutable out of the box. It's not something that you want, reverse engineered to try to give you a bit of immutability. It needs to be immutable by design, essentially.
Okay, so final question. You mentioned earlier on around testing. How often would you advise people to run tests?
As often as possible, I guess, really. But, at least restore tests at least quarterly, resilience assessments at least yearly, DR kind of assessments at least yearly. It's just whatever's feasible. Some people might do restore tests on a monthly basis. Ant, you're probably closer to the coalface to answer that question than me, but I imagine it's
similar. We've got clients who test weekly. We've got clients who test monthly. But again, it's the substance of that test. So again, there's automated methods of doing some of these tests. So it's not necessarily an operational expense to test weekly or test monthly, depending on what backup solution you're using and what your infrastructure and backup design looks like. So we've got clients who do, as I said, weekly tests, or they'll do tests of different groups of workloads, weekly or monthly on rotation. All of those are valid, but I think the real part of the test is thinking, well, if we are attacked and we do lose X, Y, or Z, which is part of our current chain, how will we work at that point? And I think that's not so much just testing. I think that's more planning around that to understand it. And as you said, if some of the responders to the poll were saying sort of 4 to 7 days, then even, for example, having your data replicated, because this comes up quite a lot, having replicated to, say, a DR location, that's not necessarily going to be usable in a ransomware situation. It might be, but not necessarily. So I think you have to consider everything. Often we find when a client says they have a really very low RTO, they will look at having it, fully replicated site to site. It might be within their own infrastructure, or they might be using a third party to do that, that second site for them. But again, I think you need to be looking at it as part of specifically a ransomware attack. Those types of solutions are great for, what used to be DR events, which was, fire, flood, theft, perfect for that. But ransomware obviously can be much more intrusive. And so if you have got a DR strategy, it needs to be part of that DR strategy, and you need to be testing it accordingly. And whether that be weekly, monthly, quarterly, every 6 months, obviously it's going to depend on your particular requirements and the industry that you're in.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks for that. So there's actually one final question I'd like to address, because I don't think we've touched about this. So there was a question around, this was specifically in the market of Saudi Arabia, and they're asking around, like, people have confidence in backup, but there's lots of data sovereignty issues around there. So I guess backing up to public cloud is great, and it has its place, but there has to be some assurance around data sovereignty. If you've got any final thoughts on that, that might be useful to hear.
I think it's become a much bigger thing recently due to the geopolitical situation, that we were talking about data sovereignty, 5-10 years ago, especially in relation, obviously, to the cloud. But I think of late, it's become much more of a hot topic due to just geopolitical risk. Obviously, if you're backing up on-prem, then you have ultimate sovereignty over your data. If you're using one of the public cloud providers, most of them tend to be big US-owned companies. However, there are others that are European-owned, and there are quite a few emerging public cloud providers that are based in Europe. We're tending to find continental Europe, there is much more of a drive towards looking at alternatives to some of the dominant players in the public cloud space. In the UK, murmurings, but not so much. That's my opinion. I don't know if you wanted to add to that. And
to be honest, I completely agree. In mainland Europe, it seems to be a sort of a hot topic of conversation in all conversations. In the UK, I think we're probably a bit late to the party, and also some of the news that's very European specific hasn't translated across to the UK, although we're in this exact same situation. Again, I think, if your business is reliant on data, ensuring that you have a copy that, regardless of what happens, you've got access to, that needs to again be part of the strategy. I'm not saying it's got the same risk potential as obviously something like ransomware or even hardware failure, that type of stuff. But ultimately, if the only copy of your data is within a large hyperscaler, then obviously there is inherent sovereignty risk with that. So I think it needs to again be part of your consideration.
It comes back to the point that, whatever solution you look to put in place, if you are looking to put something in place to deal with this kind of scenario, is you have to make sure that you are able to cluster it. You need it to be multi-node. If you want true sovereignty, you have your appliance on premise, and then obviously you co-locate one somewhere else in a different region, in a different country. But, to get the right kind of availability, you need to have the right solution in place that you're able to cluster. So really, if you want ultimate sovereignty, then you really need to have control of the repositories that you're backing up to, that you're storing data on. And the only way really to do that is to not use an IaaS or a public cloud provider. It is to keep it all within your own domain.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that. We're at time now, so I'll just wrap up very briefly. I think I've definitely understood there's sort of three main topics that have come out very strongly today. So not just to rely on what you hear is immutable, just make sure that that data that you're backing up is truly cyber resilient. So it's definitely locked down, it's protected. Having an on-premise copy of that critical and sensitive data just to help in speed of recovery, because you might not be able to get to the cloud. And finally, test. So keep on top of the situation, keep testing, and keep being aware. So thank you very much, guys, on the panel. That was really insightful. Really enjoyed that conversation. And thank you, everyone, for your interaction and taking place in the polls.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Cheers.